Hi, I'm Zach Winegardner, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Design at Ohio State University and also an interactive designer at Little Seed Incorporated. I'm going to share a research project with you today about using digital tools like image manipulation, editing, audio, and time-based media as a way to take a closer look and revisit classical artwork. In the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about these digital tools being used both as a way to investigate these paintings and see them in a little bit of an unconventional way, and also as a way to create an artifact to inspire people to be able to view them in a similar way that the tools are being used to observe them, and also some further next steps and implications of this study. So as the tools work, to imagine, I'm starting with two questions to guide this research that's really asking about the digital tools being used to uncover and unravel these complexities and things that might go unnoticed, and also how they can work as a potential method of inquiry. And the purpose of those is so that we can understand these issues of engagement when it comes to complex artwork. How do people engage with those and start to dig in their own personal ways, but also where are the opportunities for educational engagement surrounding them, specifically in a contemporary setting, hopefully by using dialogue between viewers. And I ended up using Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire. It's a series of 5 paintings as a case study, mostly because I have strong Euclidean space. We feel like we could occupy these. There's a strong sense of time and narrative, and they're obviously related as part of a series. And I ended up using a design-oriented research approach to where this question and curiosity is sort of infused into an artifact or a making process to better understand it. And my curiosity immediately brought me to manipulating these images, specifically their opacity, so I could see 2 of them at the same time and start to isolate some different visuals and annotations. And this starts by simply bringing them as images into Photoshop to see them in a way that I hadn't before. And so I took each image from the painting series into its own layer in Photoshop so that I could isolate each one and select which ones I wanted to view together to see what was going on that I hadn't seen before. And one of those things that started to become really prominent and revealing was changing opacity of each image. So for example, if we change the opacity on the Savage State painting, we get this superimposed image to see both the Savage State and Pastoral State at the same time. And we get to notice things like being able to see how far this mountain moves within the frame. That also helps us understand that this is the same mountain between them, so it must be the same space. But also realizing just how much the perspective and the viewpoint of this painting changes. It also reveals things like this larger mountain that I hadn't seen before gave me pause to go back to the Savage State and realize that because that perspective is shifting to the right, that must be what's hidden behind the clouds in the Savage State painting. I also put in simple compositional elements like the golden spiral and the golden sections or golden triangle. And this just helped me see what was being used compositionally and the fact that each one of these paintings was using this in some specific and presumably intentional way. So after this, I decided I wanted to make a tool that was a little bit more reactive and also more accessible so that if someone wanted to explore something like this on their own but weren't familiar with software like Photoshop or GIMP or something even like Procreate, they were able to make these different image manipulations without needing to know the different tools and functionality of the software. And I ended up developing a tool using Unity to help me with this process in a little bit more of a fluid way, and also one that was more user-friendly. So I'm still able to view all these different paintings on different layers and change their opacity with a little bit more resolution. And what this allowed me to do over time is find these different pieces of information that I didn't really notice before. Like one of them that I think is the most prominent is recognizing in this upper right corner these different symbols of each frame and how superimposed on each other they start to reinforce this story of this rise and fall of an empire. So in the Savage State, we get things like this uncertain and cloudy wild storm, that becomes trees, suggesting this more in tune with the land state. Those trees become buildings and symbols of triumphs and victories. And my favorite is understanding that this symbol of victory becomes overshadowed by a symbol of war and chaos. And then in the end, the only thing that remains in that right side is the thing that we started with in the beginning, is that mountain. Kind of as a way that I interpret as a way to suggest that no matter what we do, this is the thing that's always going to remain, is those natural elements. There's also interesting qualities specifically with destruction, to where if we view compositional elements like the golden spiral, surprisingly, this uses all four potential orientations of the golden spiral in some capacity. Some are certainly more of a primary use, but if we look at these, they all have some awareness of that spiral. So a couple of these example questions, there are many, many questions, but a few of these specific questions that came out are asking about these different visuals. How do they foreshadow one another by using both the frame space, but also the illusory space that's communicated? How are those used, and how is image composition being used to help draw our attention? And also these big, big questions of all these visual complexities. How do they relate to telling the story? And what do these mean to us in today's world? And really what's happening is a rhizomatic thinking process from Deleuze and Guattari, where it's this and then multitude of questions that come out of this process. Those new questions then sometimes inspire me to look further into literature and other resources, and then that information will lead me back into more specific exploration. Those will lead back into more specific questions, and it just goes back and forth in this nonlinear process. But one of the examples of resources that this led me to was this site called Explore Thomas Cole. And it's this wonderful resource to where some of the images are annotated, and you can zoom in and kind of look at these details, but specifically, they will give you some information on bits of the painting that reference different other resources that you can kind of follow this path. And some of it is in Cole's own journals. So you can see what he was actually thinking about at the time. And one of my favorite kind of deep dives into this is looking at specifically the destruction painting, and how the statue that is rendered in this is actually referencing the Borghese gladiator sculpture. And if you read a little bit more about this, this is actually a sculpture that it's signed by someone, but this dispute about the actual sculpture, and it resembles someone else's work, and the sculpture actually kind of changes possession. And if you really start to synthesize this information, you come to this interpretation and conclusion that possibly Cole is using this as a way to talk about this reference in the real world and this conflict over ownership. And in the context of his painting, does this also lead to war? In this kind of wink and smirk about a real world reference of conflict over ownership of a thing, and how in his work it is kind of used as this conflict and ownership over land, leading to this massive battle and ultimately war and fall of this civilization. And I think one of the interesting things in this is, yes, you could easily contest this by saying, well, why didn't you just go into the literature in the first place? And it's my strong belief that it's very overwhelming to just jump into that. It's so much information from so many other experts in these paintings. And I'm very curious, as kind of the next steps that I'll wrap up with in this presentation, is if we follow our own curiosity, how does that change our personal connection and how compelling this work is in our lives today? And if we all have our own kind of personal journey and inspire curiosity to someone to want to look at these things, how does that enable and encourage us to speak with one another so that we can see, what does this mean to us in our lives right now? So from here, I wanted to create an artifact that could help viewers see these paintings in a similar way that I observe them, to inspire them to kind of uncover those unnoticed things in a way that was accessible to them. And two artworks that inspired me in this, one was Bosch Interactive, which is a web-based tool where you can zoom in and out of the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. And there's wonderful audio that talks about what each part of this painting might sound like as an environment. And it helps draw our attention to the many different visuals in this triptych, but also show the contrast of all these different environments and little pockets of information that are rendered. And also Peter Greenaway, who's an artist that projects animated visuals on top of paintings or replicas of paintings. And in this case, showcasing the many different things that, again, might go unnoticed. In The Last Supper, for example, looking at all of the hand gestures and all the dynamic poses that are happening in this. So from there, I'm building out criteria for a film that I made called Past Pigment. And I wanted to be able to find ways that I could draw viewers' attention to specific visual elements, and audio was a wonderful candidate for that. And also specifically 5.1 surround sound to help with that process of observing them and imagining them as an environment, as a space, what exists beyond the frame. And also wanted a repeating viewing experience, specifically one that was cyclical, for two reasons. One of those is because I wanted to reinforce the idea of time in this, but also specifically cyclical time, which is suggested through this rise and fall, that kind of where it ends is also where it begins, to reinforce that idea that is communicated from Cole. So I ended up with these three cycles. One of them, the very first one, that focuses on the environment. So it specifically uses environmental sounds just to get viewers to look at things that they may not have before and train them to be attentive in their observation. The next uses composition. So how can we apply that observation to see what mathematically and compositionally in the frame space is being used to help us make connections between paintings. And then the last I call the conceptual revelation, as a way to say, hey, look at this. There's this visual and this one, and they're all referencing each other and kind of all tightly woven into this complex story that he's trying to tell. So I'd like to feature just a couple examples from each of those cycles.
Картюшка, группа имела кавычную основу. Я брал
So to conclude, the kind of next steps in this research, I like to list them out in kind of the context of stakeholders. If you're a maker, specifically a digital maker, I want you to imagine how we use the tools that we do, if it's, Photoshop or After Effects or Premiere or any type of software. It doesn't necessarily matter the software, but what it's intended to do, maybe what it's not intended to do, and how they might be able to be used in these different ways to get us to uncover and revisualize things that we think we understand, but maybe we're missing something. If you're design research, I'm hopeful that this can be inspiring to see how we can use critical making in play as a way to generate new questions, things that we weren't asking before. And for art and museum educators, that's kind of what I'm most interested in, is seeing how can we build something that can inspire people to view them in these unconventional ways, that we might be able to train them to look and ask and start to build their own curiosity. It's something I'm extremely invested in, is how can we inspire curiosity so that someone has this motivation to find more, but specifically talk to each other. And I think that is kind of this next step of how we can imagine these in this contemporary setting of what does this mean to me today? And there's a quote from Cole's own words that I think can start to unlock this. And about the destruction painting in that series, he says, "If men were not insensible to the beauty of nature, the great works necessary for the purposes of commerce might be carried on without destroying it, and at times might even contribute to her charms by rendering her more accessible. But it is not so. They desecrate whatever they touch. They cut down the forests with a wantonness for which there is no excuse, even gain, and leave the herbless rocks to glimmer in the burning sun." And if you read some of his other journal entries, he's deeply concerned about humans' desecration of nature and this lack of harmony between building civilization, but also respecting and this balance between the natural world and this human-built world. And the very unfortunate and very sad part is this is still a problem, if not more of a problem today. And I think there's really interesting ideas that this series of paintings is almost 200 years old. And we often find these paintings of like, they're in the past, but the ideas that they communicate and the things that he's invested in as an artist are still relevant today. And there's another quote that he even talks about in the Consummation of Empire, the middle painting in the series, that he speaks of hearing these people celebrating a political win, but he goes on to talk about how they're not invested in these good works for the public, but instead simply because their party won. And in the US, it's a huge problem still of division. And I think that if we start to find a path from our own curiosity and speak with one another to create dialogue, we can find out, hey, these ideas that are in these relatively old paintings are still relevant today, and they still have meaning, and they still have a lot of value. So further reading, I put up some of the resources that I chased if you're interested in reading more. And I also have some of my information. I'm always open and welcome and love getting questions and talking about these. So you're always welcome to contact me, as well as if you want to see some of my other work, or Little Seed Incorporated, some of the work that we do there as well. I genuinely appreciate your time. Thank you.